Scott sat in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. The scars of last night still clung to him. His breakdown, the fire department showing up, Margaret's patience stretched thin but not quite breaking. He shifted in his seat, feeling the lingering discomfort of his diaper, and Margaret, ever perceptive, caught on immediately. "Well, buddy," she said, hands on her hips, "we've got a long day ahead of us. But first, we need to get you changed because you, my dear, are stinky." Scott's ears burned, but he didn't argue. Margaret wheeled him into the bathroom, efficiently handling the situation as she always did. He had long given up on protesting. It was routine now. Still embarrassing, still uncomfortable, but at least it wasn't a battle. Once he was fresh and in a clean outfit, she wheeled him back out to the minivan. "Today's a big one," she announced. "We're going to the park to test out the Mobility Man scooter on all-terrain." Scott raised an eyebrow. "All-terrain?" Margaret nodded, her enthusiasm unwavering. "We're going to push it to its limits." Scott sighed but didn't complain. He was learning, slowly, that he needed to accept help, even if he didn't like it. And if he was honest, the Mobility Man scooter was growing on him. It gave him more control, more movement. It wasn't diving, but it was something. Once they arrived at the park, Margaret helped him into the scooter, securing the straps and making sure everything was adjusted. Scott gripped the controls and took a deep breath. Then he was off. The scooter handled hills like a pro, rolling easily over dirt paths, maneuvering through grass, and even gliding over a log with a slight bump. It wasn't graceful, but it was something close to freedom. They hiked for a while, Margaret walking beside him, chatting as if this were just any other day. For a moment, Scott forgot. Forgot about the accident, about the hospital, about the diapers and the feeding and the never-ending adjustments. He just moved. Then, as they were about to head back to the van, it hit him. He stiffened, his stomach twisting. Margaret, noticing his expression, stopped mid-step. "What's wrong?" Scott clenched his jaw. I have to go." Margaret tilted her head, waiting. Scott looked away, voice quieter. "I already did." Understanding dawned in her expression, but she didn't make a big deal out of it. "Okay," she said simply. "Let's get you to the van." Scott hesitated. "Not here. People will see." Margaret smiled, gentle but firm. "Scott, nobody cares, and even if they did, you'd never see them again. But if it makes you feel better, I'll change you in the van." Scott nodded stiffly. As they reached the van, Margaret efficiently set up his supplies, moving with practiced ease. He kept his eyes shut the whole time, mortified, but she hummed as she worked, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. And maybe, in their world, it was. After they were done, they grabbed some dinner, and just when Scott thought he was free for the evening, Margaret dropped the bomb. "I think you should go to a support group." Scott scowled. "No." Margaret ignored him. "It's for people adjusting to paralysis. It might help." Scott crossed his arms. "I don't need a group of people complaining about their lives." Margaret sighed. "You need to talk about it, Scott." "I don't." "You do." "I just went hiking," Scott exclaimed. "I don't need a cry session. I need to get stronger. I need to focus on getting back to where I was." Margaret softened. "Scott, you're not going back to where you were. You're moving forward, and that means accepting where you are now." Scott glared at her, but Margaret was immovable. He could argue all night, and she still wouldn't let him win. So, reluctantly, he let her load him into the van, fuming in silence. The drive to the church basement was tense, neither of them speaking. When they arrived, Scott took one look at the circle of wheelchairs and immediately regretted everything. An older black man sat at the head of the group. "All right, folks," he began. "Let's get started." He glanced at Scott. "New face. What's your name?" Scott shifted uncomfortably. "Scott." "Welcome, Scott. I'm Kenneth." He leaned forward slightly. "Now, I know a lot of us here used to be independent, never relying on anyone. I was the same way. But when I was a kid, my grandma used to say, 'A closed mouth don't get fed.'" Scott frowned. Kenneth smirked. Basically, you gotta speak up when you need help. There were murmurs of agreement. Scott crossed his arms. I'll tell you something, Kenneth continued. When I first got paralyzed, I didn't even know how to use the bathroom. Believe it or not, I had to wear diapers. Scott stiffened. He heard the words, but more than that, he felt them. He wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the worst thing in the world. By the end of the meeting, he was still hesitant, but something inside him had shifted. He sat with Margaret, sipping bad coffee and nibbling on a cookie, when Kenneth walked up to them. So, Kenneth said, grinning, what did you think? Scott smirked. I wasn't gonna come, but she made me. Kenneth laughed. That sounds about right. He glanced at Margaret. Don't force him into anything, except therapy. Scott rolled his eyes. I get it. Then he paused, shifting. We should probably get home. I've got a bit of a situation. Margaret snorted. Scott, just say you need a diaper change. Scott groaned. Kenneth grinned. Man, you'll get used to it. As they left, Scott thought about those words. Maybe someday he would. But that night, lying in bed, Scott thought about it more. About independence, about accepting help, about everything Kenneth had said. He turned his head slightly, watching the nightlight glow dimly across the room. He could hear Margaret in the kitchen cleaning up, humming to herself. For the first time in weeks, Scott didn't feel like fighting. Maybe he could figure this out. Maybe Margaret was right. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Mommy Sarah's Story Time. If you enjoyed the stories, please support the channel by liking and subscribing. Remember, my channel is not monetized, and I write most of the content myself. On occasions when I don't, it's sourced through emails from trusted contacts. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. If you're able to, consider making a donation to support our channel. Your support means a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you.